There sure are a lot of things to explore in those 13 verses we just heard. I've been a part of a church that did one of those Beatitudes per Sunday in their series on the Sermon on the Mount. And with the youth who are also studying the Sermon on the Mount at the same time that we are right now, we did the Beatitudes in 2 parts. So we have an option here. I can either give you the hour-long version or the 20-minute version. I'm guessing you're probably leaning towards the 20 because we want to beat the other churches to El Cerrito for lunch. All joking aside, I think this is a very powerful passage, and I think it's very powerful that it comes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Only because it gives us a good summary of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, but because it sets the stage in a way that I think is extremely important. Because in reality, fear dominates our lives. So much so, we have a war on it by its other name, terror. But it's not always the horrific things that we see, like shootings, bombings, racist rallies, and threats of mass destruction. Fear holds us prisoner in many other most mundane of situations. We hardly see it. We hardly recognize it or recognize the shackles that it has around our wrists. Often we only notice our fears when we are forced to face it. Now, I'm not talking about the normal sort of fears like the fear of heights. That's a legitimate fear in the face of our good old friend, gravity. I'm talking about the kinds of fears that show their ugly face when we witness God at work. The fears that hold us back from responding to that still, small voice. Or maybe the fears that hold us back from even listening to that still, small voice at all. You can notice those fears when we start talking about all the reasons why not to do something, or when we start to explain away our calling as something that I'm just not ready for. But it's only natural, really. The unknown and the unpredictable inspires fear in all of us. Some of us do enjoy spontaneity and innovation, but even that has our limits within us. At some point or another, the fear binds us, and we try to remain in a place of comfort. Sure, we talk about going outside of our comfort zone, which is a great idea in principle, but I think we always hold on to this reality that we can slide back into our comfortable place just moments later. But what if? What if that's not the end of the story? What if there was some assurance? What if, along with the invitation into something new that God is doing, it came with a promise that would never be broken? What if a promise of God's own presence and grace was given to help dispel our fears? What if our fears didn't get the last word? Or in the case of the Sermon on the Mount, even getting the first word? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says some pretty radical things. Jesus preaches on God's kingdom entering into our world now, not in some off in the future time. But since God decided to give us this crazy thing called free will, we're given this invitation. And I could talk now about, what this is telling us to do. But instead, I want to focus on what God is offering to us in the midst of it. Our fear grips us because the work before us is not easy. It often means going against the grain. It often means loving our neighbors and our enemies. It means challenging injustice, speaking truth to power, and can mean risking quite a bit along the way. So quite appropriately, I would say, Jesus begins his teachings with the Beatitudes. These 10 verses are like a preview of what is to come with a notable difference. They're infused with assurance of God's grace and presence with us. It's like God saying to us, I've welcomed you into this new world I'm creating in your midst. But I'm not going to leave you or forsake you. Before you hear anything else, I want to offer you my grace. So as we begin our series of sermons on what some have called the Great Sermon, my hope is that you will hear the way in which God offers presence and grace in the midst of some pretty awe and fear-inspiring ways of living as God's kingdom people now. So the Beatitudes. A few things that I just want to note before I get into the specifics. This name, the Beatitudes, comes from a Latin word that means blessing or blessed, which is why these verses often start with this idea of being blessed are the. But in our culture, we kind of get confused because we a lot of the time think of a blessing as something that we can consume. It's something that's for us. It's about stuff. But what it really means is to experience God's favor. Or as I'm kind of rewording it here, experiencing God's presence and grace in the midst of our lives. Now, Jesus isn't pulling together all these ideas from somewhere random. Jesus is quoting and referencing the Old Testament, whether we know it or not. It's an ancient and yet new way of living that Jesus is showing us. And when I say justice, I want us to think about this biblical form of justice that Jesus is referring to. The justice that's restorative in nature. That's not about punishment, but about helping things to be right, helping things to be whole, helping people, situations, groups to find shalom. It's not a list of things to do to get into heaven, but it's painting a picture of what God is going to do in our midst, how we can journey with God and experience God, the hope of God's presence and grace. So let's look at some of these verses. The first and second to last, I've paired together here. Blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, because they come with the same assurance. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They get at the core of what it means to be set apart as followers of Christ in the world, trusting God and having this willingness to suffer for doing so. In the first century, I want to point out that being poor didn't just refer to having empty pockets like the picture above us. Being poor meant having very little ability to provide for oneself and a low social standing. And so being poor in spirit, I'm wanting to interpret as having the spirituality of someone in that position. Someone that is completely reliant on God for their social, for their financial, for their personal well-being. It's not necessarily saying that we all need to become poor, for how could we have this church? How could we have the many good things, the missions organizations, the service organizations that do great things without funds to make it happen? But instead, in whatever circumstance we find ourselves, to be in that place of trust. And as our relationship with God deepens, so does that trust. And we tend to do things that put us on the outside. Maybe we're giving more than one would expect. Maybe we're buying a smaller house or a less fancy car because we want to be able to be more generous. This can lead to persecution. Now, not necessarily in our country so much, but we know that that does happen around the world. And I think a fear that I hear behind these verses is what it might mean for us to be on the outside. Maybe we don't receive the same kind of physical persecution, But maybe we're seen as weird. We're seen as strange. We're seen as that person we're not so sure what to do with. Nobody wants to be that. Nobody wants to be the person left out. It's like when you're in grade school and you're the last one picked for kickball. Nobody wants to be that guy. But God offers his presence and his grace in the form of a reversal of this. A new community where everyone is honored. And an economy that functions out of abundance rather than scarcity. The next few are paired together because of the way that they show us living differently. And they show us living differently in a response to justice and injustice. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they'll inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now, mourning here obviously does refer to those who are experiencing the loss of someone they love. But it extends beyond that. As I dove into a Jewish understanding of this, they pointed out how it also is a recognition, mourning the loss of justice in our world, in the many forms it comes. Injustice of all kinds, pain and suffering that comes from natural and unnatural disasters, the depletion and destruction of our world, the hurting of people around us for our own gain. Now, the meek, well, they are those who are perhaps quiet and gentle and not easily provoked, which we might associate with weakness. But these are not weak people. They are perhaps even stronger than we would expect, because rather than using their positions to bring about justice unjustly, they choose justice all the way through. And this part about those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Well, righteousness and justice in the Old Testament were two different things, but in the New Testament, we see only one word that means both of these. And I think that this is a growth in human understanding of how righteousness and justice go hand in hand. That doing right by others is the same thing as doing right by God. Seeing God's people living justly and all of humanity living justly honors God in the greatest of ways. Now, of course, doing these things, living in this way, means we're releasing a lot of power. We're not willing to grasp and take, but rather, we're willing to follow the justice of God. We're willing to live into what God offers. We feel the call of justice and we go forward, but our fear is that we might be overlooked. Our fear is that we might be unheard. Our fear is that we might be taken advantage of. But God again reverses that. God offers comfort. God offers an inheritance beyond all measure. God says we will be filled. It's an assurance of shalom, of harmony, of wholeness, of peace. Assurance that God will fill this world with justice and is filling the world with justice today. The next three group together because I think they show us reflecting God's character. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Mercy. Taking the different option, the third way perhaps. It's not ignoring, it's not apathy, and it's not wholehearted punishment. It's finding a way between that in which recognizes the injustice, but offers something different. Now, this verse is not saying that God's mercy on us depends on our mercy on others. There are perhaps other verses that speak to this. I think what this is referring to is that we don't know what mercy really is until we've given it. Think of it this way. If you've never extended mercy to someone, how will you really know how that feels to receive it? Forgiveness requires us to take on consequences rather than putting those consequences on the other. Mercy is the same way. We're willing to take on the pain. We're willing to take on the hurt so that the other doesn't have to. It's an act of great love that we see in God over and over and over again. Willing to walk in the midst of our sin and forgive us. Speaking of sin, the next piece on the pure in heart. And of course, at some level that does mean our ability to free ourselves from sin, but we all realize that, and I'm sure the oldest among us will affirm that you will never be completely pure of heart. We will never be completely free of sin, and that's not even what this is getting at. To be pure in heart means to have a clear vision of justice, being able to see the wrong, maybe not always stopping it, but being able to see when things do go wrong. And in seeing justice, I think we see God. The two are very connected. Finally, the peacemakers. I think we're really fond of this verse as Mennonites for obvious reasons. And we know because later in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:38-48, that this means acting for peace in nonviolent but active ways. It means not threatening, not harming, not killing to bring about peace. It's a peace that comes at a level of personal sacrifice. And I think that's often where our fear comes in with all of these things, is that they all require us to sacrifice. Now, of course, I love this last part. They will be called the children of God. Well, children, as we all know, as science and casual observers reveal, children often take on the characteristics of their parents. And like I shared with the youth today, one day we will have that moment and be like, ugh, I'm my mother. But then maybe we'll also realize our mother was teaching us something very important at that time. We all take after our parents in some way, shape, or form, maybe in our pure rebellion. But the beautiful thing that it's said here is that we reflect the character of God in that we take on the pain of our world. Now, hopefully we don't do that in a way that we are seeking hurt, but we do it as an act of mercy. We do it as we see injustice and want to present a better way. We make peace even when we're afraid, terrified of what that might look like for us. That perhaps rather than threatening, hurting, or killing others, it might mean that we are threatened, that we are hurt, or that we are killed for justice. But God offers grace and presence in the midst of that, and it is manifest in God's work of peacemaking and mercy that we feel. We can see that God is there with us. We can feel the very presence of God in those circumstances. Finally, this last verse, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Yeah, I should have toned that a little differently. Anyway, Jesus is making it personal here. Jesus is saying, this isn't some far-off reality. Jesus is connecting this to Jesus' own life. Jesus is not naive to the reality that by living in this crazy way that he's talking about, that it's going to be hard. Obviously, Jesus pays the ultimate price in in pushing back against the status quo, in challenging the very nature of society, he is killed. And he connects that to the prophets of old who were threatened, who were hurt, who were killed for their message from God. As one author so plainly puts it, the world is full of sin and will not always welcome our good news. And yet God offers himself, the very presence of God, the grace of God in the midst of that. We look at this and we say, great is your reward in heaven. And I don't think that's just talking about something later. Because the church is meant to be a foretaste of heaven on earth now. And in some ways I want to say, great is your reward among the body of believers. Because that is where we experience God's presence. That is where we feel the love and the grace of God manifest in one another, both giving and receiving. So in this way, fear does not get the last word. Fear does not get to dictate what we can and cannot do. As we journey with God, we find ourselves at odds with the world around us. But believe it or not, it is our accepting of God's presence and grace in our midst that fear can be cast out and God can transform us. And we can begin to transform the world around us. Like the Anabaptist martyrs before us, the good news is proclaimed more profoundly in our actions that match our words than in those that speak great words but have no actions. Those who are leaving faith in churches across North America are doing so for this very reason. That the church is not being the church. Our fears have caught us. We have become trapped. But faith is so much more than theological statements, institutions, and doctrine. Faith is grounded in a trust, in relationship, in a vision of shared hope. So let us therefore go forth with hope, knowing that God is utterly trustworthy and offers us his grace and presence in every moment, in every situation, in every place. Amen.